Good morning and welcome to the Lewis County Public Library's Lumos Storytime for teens, tweens, and the magical at heart. Today we're starting our fantasy, fairy tale, myth, legend, lore series that ties in with our summer reading program. And we hope that you really enjoy our summer reading program this year and that you participate in our online and the in-person activities as we have them. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the video. For today's story, we're going to be reading from the To Hold the Bridge collection of short stories by Garth Nix, The Silent Night. The Quiet Night. No going out till you've split that wood, Tony. All 2 tons, you hear? Tony looked up from lacing his outdoor boots and made a gesture to indicate he'd already done that job. His father understood the sign, but he still went outside to check, returning a few minutes later as Tony was finishing winding the lace around the top of his left boot. When'd you do it? Tony held up 5 fingers and curled back his forefinger to make it 4.5. 4:30? This morning before school? His father exclaimed. You're crazy, son, but good on you for getting it done. You must have chopped like crazy. Tony nodded. He had chopped like crazy. He'd enjoyed it, though, crossing the lawn to the shed, the frost crackling under his boots. It had been cold to start with, and quite dark with the single light bulb above his head. But as he'd swung the blockbuster, split the wood, and stacked it, he'd gotten hot very quickly, and the sun had come up bright and strong. What is it tonight? Basketball practice? Tony nodded again and shrugged on his backpack. It was a full-on hiker's backpack, not a school satchel or day bag. He carried it everywhere outside school, notionally for all his sporting equipment, and his father had gotten used to it long ago and didn't inquire about what was actually inside. Considering how much practice you do, it's a wonder you guys never win a game, said his father. He'd been an all-around athlete in his youth, and he couldn't help but needle Tony about it a little with his lack of sporting success. He didn't come to the games either, not for the last few years. He didn't like being with the other dads when Tony's team didn't win. He was also too busy. Though they lived on a farm on the outskirts of the city, it was a hobby farm, a tax deduction, and a sideline interest for his dad, who was the senior executive in some shadowy government intelligence outfit. Tony's mother and younger sister lived on the other side of the city, almost an hour's drive away. He spent some time with them, but not much. He preferred the farm, even though it took him 40 minutes to get to school on the bus. Tony settled his pack, then mind turning the car key to his dad. You want to borrow the monster again? Tony nodded. You know, it wouldn't hurt you to talk to me. Sorry, mumbled Tony. His voice was low and scratchy. It sounded like rough scrubbing brushes being drawn across broken stones. He'd accidentally drunk some bathroom cleaner when he was little, and it had burned his throat and larynx. His mother had blamed his father for it, and his father still blamed himself. Can I borrow the car? Of course. Be careful. No drinking after practice. None at all, you hear? Tony nodded. He looked old enough he could easily pass for a legal drinking age. He stood 6'4" on bare feet and took after his father in both his heavy build and an early onset of dark stubble on his face. But he planned no drinking, and he wasn't going to basketball practice anyway. He took the keys to the farm truck. His father moved as if to hug him, but didn't follow through. Tony waited stolidly, ready to hug if that was required to get the keys. Okay, I'll see you later. I'll be in my study working till late. Check in when you get home. Tony nodded and walked out into the cool, near-freezing air of the night. The backpack held his armor, belt, helmet, and mask. His foam-wrapped PVC pipe, boffer sword, was in a sack in the tray of the truck. Tony checked it was still there, unlacing the top. His dad hardly ever used the truck and practically never looked in the back, but a good knight always checks his weapons before venturing to battle. That night's game was being held in the usual place, the old wool shed and farm buildings on Dave Nash's property. Dave was a big mover and shaker in LARP circles. He'd been involved in live-action role-playing for more than 20 years. He was in his 40s, heavier and slower than in the pictures and videos Tony had seen. He was still a tough fighter, though he mostly ran the games rather than participating in them. Tony parked the truck off the road a half a mile from the Nash property, edging it well behind a fringe of trees. It was a rural road and not much traveled, but there would be other LARP gamers heading along it later, and he didn't want them to spot him or the vehicle. It took him 10 minutes to get his armor on. First, there was the athletic supporter and the padded undergarment, which were easy enough. It was the thigh-length fabric made of thousands of steel rings that was the hassle. It was a lot easier if you had help to lace the back up, but he'd worked out a method using a long leather strap and a lot of wriggling about. He didn't change his boots, but tied on a pair of gaiters that disguised them so they looked more medieval. The hauberk was long enough to protect his thighs, but he strapped on converted ice hockey armor to his shins and knees. It was painted black and looked okay, or at least it would in the partially lit game that would occur tonight. Tony's helmet was fairly basic. Unlike the hauberk, which he'd bought with the unwitting assistance of his mother, he'd made it himself in Dave's workshop with a lot of help. It was modeled on a classic Norman nasal bar helmet and went on over the padded lining and a mail coif, which also protected his neck. With almost everything on, Tony added the final unique touch, a half mask of beaten gold, actually gold paint over tough plastic, that covered his face from the chin to just below his eyes. It locked onto the nasal bar and the sides of the helmet and was perforated so he could breathe and talk if he wanted to do that. All armored up, Tony tested his movement, jumping, springing, lunging, and stepping back. Everything was on right and tight, so he strapped on his belt and put on his leather gauntlets. Last of all, he took up his sword, practiced a few test swings and cuts, then laid it to rest on his shoulder. There was a beaten track made by the sheep along the inside of the barbed wire fence that paralleled the road some 10 yards in. Tony had made a rough style when he first started going to the LARP sessions a few years before, just a log up against the corner posts that he could run up and jump down the other side. He checked that too before he went over. It would be very embarrassing to break a leg out here alone in full armor. As he always did, Tony stopped at the edge of the roadside trees to observe who was waiting outside the woolshed before he went on. The woolshed itself was a huge, vast, barn-like relic of bygone days when 200 shearers worked inside, shearing several thousand sheep a day. Dave Nash had partitioned it up inside with movable walls and scenery like a theater so he could arrange all kinds of different scenarios. The LARP group used the paddocks outside as well and the smaller buildings. For evening games like this one, they always chose a night when the moon was full. It wasn't up yet, so all the exterior lights were on, including the big floodlights in the front of the woolshed. They lit up the bare dirt field in front that used as a car park. There were a half a dozen cars there now, parked as far from the woolshed as possible, in the half dark so they wouldn't detract from the atmosphere. Tony recognized all but one of them. Seeing a strange car made him cautious, so he carefully scanned the group around the front steps of the woolshed. Dave Nash was standing there in his wizard's robes, which meant he would be the game master and not an active participant. Next to him were the twins, Jubal and Jariah, equipped and dressed with elven scouts with green and tan leather, with their boffer long swords at their sides. They didn't have their bows. Dave didn't allow even boffered bows since he nearly lost an eye a few years before. Other groups did use them, and Jubal and Jira were fine archers, even with the very light draw bows used in LARP. Besides Jubal and Jira, there were 5 regulars Tony knew, all of them already geared up in armor from Dave's orc armory, with an array of foam court axes, halberds, and other pole arms. Their latex masks and helmets were stacked up on the steps. No one put them on until they had to. It got hot and sweaty very quickly fighting in a latex mask. But it looked good. That meant the strange car belonged to the 2 people Tony didn't know. A girl he guessed was around his age who wasn't wearing armor, but a servable dress of red and gold, square cut around the neck. She had a lute on her back and a reed pipe through the gold cloth belt she wore, so was clearly a bard. The boy at her side was younger and had the same dark but slightly strange good looks as the girl, so Tony guessed they were brother and sister. He wore leather trousers, a leather brigandine coat, and a leather cap that was a bit like a World War I aviator's helmet. 2 long daggers were thrust through the broad loops of his belt. Boffer weapons didn't scabbard very easily. The foam cladding made them bulky, but was of course essential to not getting hurt. Dave walked up to the top step, tapping his way with a 6-foot oaken staff that was tipped with a xylem chemical light. He turned at the top and spread his arms wide. "Are all who would essay tonight's adventure present?" "Aye!" the people around the steps called. Tony hesitated, then strode forward to the light, stamping at his feet as he walked so he made more noise. "Ah, the quiet night approaches," declaimed Dave with a smile flitting across his face. He was the only one who knew who Tony actually was, and he respected the confidence. "You are welcome as always, Sir Silent." Tony saluted with his sword and went to stand off to one side, near but not close to Jubal and Gyra. "We have 2 newcomers recently moved to our fair realm," said Dave. "Soroya the Bard and Horace the Halfling Rogue. Welcome, Soroya and Horace." Soroya was cute, Tony thought, and she and Horace were definitely brother and sister. They had the same nose and eyes, and probably the same ears, though it was hard to tell as Horace had stuck artificial hairy ears over his own. "Tonight we seek to find passage through the ancient tunnels of Harukin Jar," said Dave. He nodded to the orcs and picked up their masks and helmets and walked off to one of the entrances around the side of the woodshed. "If we can but find a way, we may escape those who have pursued us from the wilds." Tony listened carefully as Dave set up the scene. Tunnels meant that Dave would have spent the last week rearranging the walls and lowering the temporary ceilings inside the woodshed. And there would be lots of close combat, with only enough light for safety. Dave liked strobe lights too, and color effects for magic, and he had a lot to work with since he'd bought all the old lighting gears, sets, and props when the city had condemned the Alder Street Theater. "We begin the long crawl through the zigzag way," intoned Dave. "Horace, will you scout a little ahead? Not too far, mind. 10 feet, no more." "Aye," said Horace. He drew his daggers and moved to the door. "Sir Silent, if you would follow, and Soroya behind you," said Dave. "I task you with protecting the bard, for she wears no armor and will need her magic and her song in times to come. I will follow, and Jubal and Gyra will guard our rear." Soroya came over to Tony and curtsied. Tony bowed back. "I thank you for your protection, gallant knight," she said. He liked her voice. It sounded cool and pure, and she had the trace of some foreign accent that sounded real, not like it was put on for the game. He bowed again and led the way up the steps. Horace was lying on his stomach, listening at the gap at the bottom of the door. As Tony approached, he stood up slowly and opened it. There was darkness within, but slowly a weak red light blossomed, revealing a narrow passage no more than 3 feet high. "The long crawl," hissed Dave. "Let the adventure begin." Tony didn't get home till just before midnight, his curfew time. It had been a great game, one of the best, and the others had stayed behind to have a drink and chat around the fire, wrapped in the cloaks from a long-ago Alder Street production of Henry V. Tony had wanted to stay, too, to talk to Soroya, and it wasn't the curfew that stopped him. It was his inability to talk. He knew that as soon as he opened his mouth and she heard his hoarse crow voice, her face would show scorn, or even worse, pity. He didn't want that. She respected him as the quiet knight, and they had enjoyed playing their parts. It was best to keep whatever they had in the game. Tony laughed at himself for thinking such stupid thoughts. Whatever they had, they didn't have anything. He'd protected her in the game, sure enough, and had taken bruises enough to show for it, including the one across the back of his left hand that was coming up purple and brown. But that didn't mean anything in real life. He didn't even know her real name or where she lived or anything. Tony was sore, and his arms and legs were very stiff the next morning. Splitting 2 tons of wood for the potbelly stove and later fighting for 4 hours was way too much. Too much even for a blindingly hot shower to totally remedy. His bruises had come up as well on his hands and forearms, and one on the back of his leg. He applied anti-inflammatory cream to the worst of them, but it didn't take a painkiller. The bus trip to school was normal. Tony sat 2/3 of the way back, alone as always, with the hood of his sweatshirt pulled up over his head. He was big and mean-looking enough that the bullies and the petty annoyers left him alone, but since he didn't talk, no one else interacted with him either. In fact, most of them, including the bullies, were afraid of his dark hooded presence, though he didn't know that. He spent the time looking out the window, wondering what he was doing with his life. There was one more year of school to get through, which he could do. His grades were good, better than anyone ever expected from a silent ox. But he had no friends. Not real friends. Dave was the closest to a real friend he had, but Dave had a family and a job and was just being kind to a kid. Tony supposed he could be friends with Jubal and Jaira. They went to the same school, though they were a year behind. They had lots of friends too, gamers and fantasy freaks and alternative drama types. That was the trouble. Tony already felt he was an outcast. A disguised outcast, to be sure. He looked normal enough. No one in the street would ever know he had a weird voice and liked to play dress-up and play pretend fighting. If he revealed himself to Jubal and Jaira as the Quiet Knight, they probably would welcome him as a friend, and he could hang out with their friends. But everyone would know he was a real weirdo. Besides, if he had friends, they would expect him to talk. What would the Quiet Knight do? Tony asked himself. Not talk, that's for sure. He'd just get on with things in his own quiet way. But the bus stopped outside the school. Tony waited for everyone to get out, then slowly followed, steeling himself for another day of trying to minimally answer questions. The teachers didn't usually push him too much now, not after a long trial with one particular English teacher from a few years before, which had ended with Tony still stubbornly refusing to deliver a speech, his father raging in the headmaster's office, and the teacher requesting a transfer to another class. The usual stream of student foot traffic filled the front drive, and most of them heading for the main doors, with knots of people here and there delaying the inevitable. Tony strode through them, his mind on last night's game. Younger students scattered out of his way without him noticing. He didn't know that he had a legend to the lower years. His reluctance to talk transformed into a story of backwoods tongue mutilation and bloody revenge, even if the backwoods in question were only 10 miles past the suburbs. There was a small commotion just before the doors, to the left of the front steps, in the blind spot that was hidden from the security cameras out front and the gaze of the teacher on door duty. There was often something going on there. It was a favorite spot for some casual bullying or lunch money shakedowns. Tony never paid much attention to this kind of thing. It never happened to him. This time, he stopped. 2 students were being terrorized by 5 of the spoiled brat girls, the ones who liked to think they were rough and tough and had some kind of gang readily identifiable by infected eyebrow piercings without the studs, since the school wouldn't allow it, and expensive leather jackets bought by their daddies and driven over to rough up. The 2 students being terrorized were Soroya and Horace. Soroya was wearing another medieval-style dress, this time dark yellow. She looked good, but totally out of place at school. Horace, though, in jeans and a t-shirt, still had on the stupid, hairy ears. 2 of the self-proclaimed bad girls were holding Soroya back with difficulty. 2 more were holding Horace, and the 5 eyebrow-piercing leader, whose name was Ellen, was trying to tear the ears off Horace. "They're stuck on! He can't get them off!" Soroya shouted. She shook off one of the girls and swung at Ellen, but there were too many of them and she was dragged back. "Help! Someone!" A baseball cap was shoved in Soroya's mouth, muffling her shouts. She kept struggling, kicking back at her captor's knees. Horace was trying to bite his enemies, tears of pain welling up as his real ears were being twisted every which way. Tony saw Soroya's frantic gaze as she looked for help, but her gaze swept across him and then she was bundled further back into the shadow of the stairs. He'd been invisible to her. Just another student who wasn't going to help, who didn't want to get involved or cross Ellen and her gang. It wasn't just her and the girls. There were their boyfriends as well, most of whom were bad-tempered, second-string jocks who weren't good enough to focus all their energy on sports. Tony stopped for what felt like ages, but could not have been longer than a second. Then he continued on up the steps, crashing through several slower students. I can't intervene, he thought. She's in a medieval dress. He's got hobbit ears on. They won't really hurt her. He stopped before the doors as another thought struck him like a blow to the heart. What would the quiet knight do? Tony turned around and pulled back his hood before taking a very deep breath. The students coming up the stairs parted like the Red Sea as he stood there, taking another breath, sucking in the air as if he were taking in strength. I must do it, he thought. I will talk to her, even if she does laugh. He ran down the stairs. Students sprang aside and dragged their friends out of his path and turned to watch as Tony rounded the wall at the base of the stair, picked up Ellen by the elbow and knee, and pitched her aside onto the pavement. Let them go, he ordered. His voice was as peculiar and scratchy and variably pitched as ever, but coming immediately after throwing their leader 6 feet through the air, incredibly effective. The bad girls released Soroya and Horace and backed away. They're under my protection, rasped Tony. You will never even talk to them again. Understood? The bad girls nodded. Go to class, added Tony. He pointed to Ellen, who was sullenly picking herself up, blood beading through her faux punk stockings where she grazed her knees. Drop her off at the infirmary and keep your mouths shut. He turned back to Soroya, and the words that had so gloriously issued from his mouth failed him. She smiled and curtsied. He looked up and blushed and averted his gaze to Horace, who shrugged and rubbed his ears. Super glue, all right, said Horace. So it was a bad idea. It goes with being called Horace in the first place. Stupid parents. They can't organize their laundry either, or my sister. Thank you again, Sir Silent, interrupted Soroya with a quelling glance at her brother. She stepped closer to Tony and looked up at him. He thought it would be very easy to rest his chin upon her silky head and draw her close. Tony tried to ask how she knew who he was. No sound came out, but his puzzled frown was clear enough. Your eyes are very distinctive, said Soroya, and the bruise on your hand. Tony nodded slowly and gulped again. He was making a fool of himself, he knew, and he felt an incredibly strong compulsion to back away, to pull his hood up and just disappear. But he wanted to stay. He wanted to talk, and so he fought against the urge to run. My name really is Soroya, by the way. Tony cleared his throat. Soroya waited patiently, smiling, looking straight into his eyes. The world faded away around them as Tony gulped at the air again and searched for the words that he knew he had to say. Tony, the quiet knight said at last. My name is Tony. The end. I hope you enjoyed this story. I know I sure did, and I look forward to reading more in this book, To Hold the Bridge by Garth Nix. We'll have our summer reading program starting up on Tuesday, so you can go ahead and download the Read Squared app and get signed up and registered for you and your family to take part in our summer reading program, Imagine Your Story, Happily Ever Hohenwald. We hope that you enjoy, have a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to taking a journey into fairyland adventures with all of you this summer. Have a good weekend.